everybody, and this is episode 110 of the Best Games Period, the podcast where every week we choose a new game and we discuss whether or not it might be one of the best games of all time. A best game period, if you will.
A BGP!
A BGP! And that was the amazing and talented voice of Naomi Lugo.
Oh, thank you. And I did a double bow, one of those fancy bows.
Ooh.
Uh-huh.
And this voice that's currently talking is Jack Gardner. And I did an elaborate curtsy.
Because we are fancy here.
We are. And I think I just totally forgot how to start the show this week because we're already like a minute in and I can tell it's all wrong from how I usually do it. I'm outside of my normal groove.
It's all good. It'll be a special episode then.
Yeah. All I know is that I wanted to brag right off the bat that last week I spelled the word loquacious during this particular segment of the podcast, and I spelled it correctly.
Live.
Because I looked it up while I was editing it, and I got it correct, and I felt
nice.
Pretty proud of myself.
Like cue audience noise here, since I still can't do that sound effect.
Yeah, but give it a good shot.
No. It just sounds like people screaming really far away. I even practiced and I still can't do it. I can't remember why that came up before. Anyway.
You had screaming practice?
Well, no, it was on this podcast, and I tried to do that noise and it didn't work. And then we had this whole thing about it, remember?
I remember. I was just off of podcast time you were practicing.
Oh, yeah, I was. And I still didn't get it. And the thing is, my partner is absolutely amazing at sound effects and stuff because he grew up on cheesy ass 80s movies like Terminator 2 and RoboCop and stuff. So he mimicked the noises on there, the explosions and whatnot. So he made fun of me and didn't teach me how to do it. So blame him.
Okay, James is thoroughly blamed.
Haha.
And with that, have you been playing anything?
Have I been playing anything? Yes, I have. I have still been playing Graveyard Keeper. Still.
Have you kept the graveyard?
I've pretty much been neglecting my graveyard.
Oh.
I've been focusing on everything else. Yeah, which is, I'm sure the game is going to punish me for that in one way or another later on, since, the name is Graveyard Keeper. So, from what I've seen over playing this game another week, this game is super awesome and complicated. Or not complicated. Well, it's got in-depth systems that I think are meant to not necessarily trick you, but you know how you can kind of rely on a game and trust a game that it's not going to lead you astray. It's going to give you the objectives. You're going to go do the objectives and then eventually you're going to beat the game. I think Graveyard Keeper is trying to turn that aspect on its head and kind of make the gamer uncertain and make them really look at the choices they make as the game progresses, which is super interesting if that is indeed how it is playing out. Yeah, I can't wait to get further in the game just so I can see how everything I'm doing is going to lead into something else. If that makes sense, I hope it did.
It did. And I'm gonna be real, pulling aside the curtain that separates reality from the podcast world.
Whoa.
Opening a rift, as it were.
I didn't know we had that power.
We do, actually. We only recorded this episode. We recorded last week's episode on Friday, and it's currently Wednesday. And so I was gone Saturday through Sunday, and then most of Monday at a wedding and also doing a bunch of personal stuff. So I haven't actually had a whole lot of time to do or play anything. So I have not played anything this week.
It's okay. No shame.
No
shame.
Shame. Was any gaming news we want to touch on?
Well, as of this recording, or as of the release of this recording, Spider-Man will have come out. Woo! For people who are excited about Spider-Man. I'm still... I don't know. I saw the demo at E3 2017, and saw something else at 2018, and it looks cool, but I'm not a huge Spider-Man fan. I mean, it looks great. Like, it looks pretty much like Arkham, but with Spidey. So the flow of combat would be really cool, but I'm not really excited to, necessarily buy it day one, play it kind of thing. So, but, we'll see how people start receiving it and all that.
I just wanted to recapture the magic I felt while playing the Spider-Man 2 PlayStation 2 classic.
I think I played that one too, and it was, oh man. I think there was like a tweet recently that showed like a mission or something. You like have a scientist and you're supposed to catch her, or she's jumping to you or something, and if you fail, there's this amazing cutscene where Spider-Man just like face plants and then like the building they're on blows up or something. So if those are the same games, yeah, I'm totally with you.
I don't remember that happening, but it was an open world game at the time, and so it could have happened. Maybe.
It was pretty fun. I mean, for what it was back in the day, I remember it being a lot of fun. Not necessarily the best game, but...
Hey, one of these days we'll talk about Spider-Man 2, and it's gonna be a best game, period.
Or will it? Ooh.
Woo! That's the question on each of these episodes. So this week we tackled a big one, I think, this week. And it's one that I've been trying to prepare myself for a long time, and I realized no amount of preparation was ever going to be enough, so might as well just dive right into it.
Same here. I was kind of... I don't know the word. I was just kind of baffled, remembering and researching all the stuff that this game actually covers, from mechanics to story to pretty much everything, and I was like, you know what? We'll just see what happens.
So this month's theme is science fiction, and we decided we were going to do it right with starting out not with maybe the most technologically advanced of video game premises, but maybe one of the strangest, built around a fundamental theory of the universe, which is BioShock Infinite.
Yeah, this is definitely a titan. So where to begin?
Well, so first off, I think there is somewhat of an impression that has floated around for the last 5 years that people who really like BioShock Infinite are super pretentious, and that this game is not that great, and that it's pretty simple and straightforward. And I would ask people who come in with that opinion to maybe just table it for a bit while we talk, and maybe we'll change your mind. Who knows? Maybe not. Probably not. It's the internet. But maybe.
Minds don't change. People aren't wrong.
Not in 2018, they don't.
No.
So, also, if you haven't played BioShock Infinite, you've had 5 years. Get on it. Go play it.
And there's a remaster, so you don't have any excuse.
Go play it, and then come back and listen. The basic premise, and I'm going to try and sum this up as succinctly as possible, is that you are a character named Booker DeWitt, and Booker has a mission to go to the city of Columbia, which is a flying city in the sky, to rescue a girl named Elizabeth, who is held in a tower in the city by a man named Father Comstock. And that is about as simple as, like, a starting premise as I can get. Like, that doesn't really change throughout the entire game. That is kind of the core mission. We have Booker, we have Comstock, and in the middle we have Elizabeth. And that setup should be pretty familiar to anyone who's played video games before or been exposed to basic storytelling tropes. It's the classic, knight in shining armor rescuing girl in tower trope.
Yeah, because she's literally in a giant angel tower.
Yes, yes. And the thing is that the game builds upon that really simple foundation with several different layers of meaning and several different layers of ideas, and it quickly becomes way more complicated than any of that. Do you have something you want to put in at this point? Because I can just jump into maybe a brief overview of all those layers.
Well, I was actually going to start kind of where the game starts.
Okay.
And that is with the introduction of Columbia. So, as the game begins in its complete opening cinematic, you are Booker, and you are with these two weirdos in a rowboat on a tumultuous sea.
Really selling it here.
Oh, yeah. So you're rowing towards this lighthouse, and these two weirdos are kind of talking nonsense about you and around you.
As if you're not there. It's
yes.
very bizarre.
And your character, Booker, is kind of out of it, and he's not really 100% on what's going on, which is interesting in terms of storytelling, because as the player, you are also in that place, at least when you do your first playthrough. So eventually you go into this lighthouse and you enter, I don't even know how to describe this thing, almost like a giant metal echo chamber ball thing.
It's like a reverse escape pod.
Yeah. And it launches you into the sky, and there's moments of panic because Booker has no idea what's going on, and it's a very intense situation where he's being launched into the air, and it counts like I can't remember if it's the pressure or if it's like the altitude. It's basically counting up. Yeah, something like that. So it's intense pressure, and you're going up through the dark clouds, and then all of a sudden you go above the clouds and the sun is shining and you see Columbia. And that moment in games, like, it still takes my breath away. Like, it's cheesy, but I'm getting chills just thinking about it and describing it. It is such a visceral moment, and they did such an excellent job at introducing this city, because it is gorgeous. I mean, this game came out back in 2007 or something like that, and it's been remastered.
2007. It's 2013.
Oh, sorry, I was thinking about the original BioShock.
Yeah,
2013. So still, it came out in 2013, which was 5 years ago. Obviously, we progressed in technology, and you can see a difference between it and the remaster for Xbox One, PS4. Or was it on PS4?
I don't know.
Anyway. Yeah, it's a good question. It is for sure on Xbox One, though. And they do this to you on purpose. Like, you're supposed to just be stunned by this beautiful Columbia, which is it's a mysterious place, because obviously it's a floating freaking city in the sky. So, that's kind of crazy on its own. But it looks like heaven. I mean, that's kind of what or it's not kind of, it's definitely the illusion it wants you to get.
Well, and it is the complete and purposeful inversion of the introduction we had to Rapture in the original BioShock. Instead of being a kind of descent into this hell of a city where everything's
turmoil,
very, very clearly just insane, and everyone is just kind of out for themselves and killing each other. Instead, you're ascending into this higher plane of existence, and it's beautiful, and it seems very peaceful, and so on.
Yeah, and so I won't go step by step into how the game intro starts, but basically, Booker walks through the town after being baptized and almost drowned by this guy, which is very significant later on in the story, of course. And there's even at one point a part where you come across what is it called? Like an a cappella group, and they sing modern-ish hits, modern compared to the setting, which is like 1912 or something like that. Like they sing a Beach Boys song. So it's very clear there's some dissonance there. Like you're in 1912, but you're hearing modern music and you're in the frickin' sky and there's technology around you that seems impossible. And that's the intro we get. And then, well, I guess I'll go to the catalyst portion of the intro. And so eventually you walk up to like this kind of mini World's Fair thing that they're throwing. And there's a skit where you see, and I can't remember exactly what happens actually.
So
but
basically the city is holding this giant festival in honor of this figure named Father Comstock, who by the time you get to this part in the introduction, it has been kind of made out to be this messianic prophet who can see the future and is almost all-powerful and is kind of the direct voice of God to the people who live in this city. And you go to this festival and they're handing out these baseballs, and each baseball has a number on it. And you happen to pick the winning number, number 77. And your reward, and I say that with the biggest air quotes, is that you get to cast the first almost literal stone. It's not a stone, it's a baseball, at this biracial couple that has been captured by the authorities of this city. And that is like a fun pastime. But also they have like... I played through a lot of this game today for the first time in years, and I had forgotten how shockingly racist a lot of the pieces of imagery in this game are.
Oh, like, yeah, definitely.
Like they have on this stage with this biracial couple, like not only are they presumably about to get beaten to death with baseballs, there are also these like almost animatronic cutouts of monkeys in human clothes, and by monkeys we all know the racial, like imagine 1930s super racist cartoon style monkeys. And yeah, then you have the option of either throwing the baseball at the couple or throwing the baseball at the announcer, and either way it's kind of a false choice, which is something that this game does a lot of the time, because before you can throw the baseball, somebody in the crowd stops you and they kind of recognize you by a sign. Booker has the letters AD carved into the back of his right hand, which is the mark of the interloper, the person who is they have all been told is coming to steal away the future of their city, which is Elizabeth. And so that's when things start going really sour, and police officers and various special forces start coming out of the woodwork to try and stop Booker from getting to Elizabeth.
Yeah, so, and if you weren't thrown off by the very, very racist imagery and actions of the town, you will be thrown off by the fact that this once peaceful town where they're, having a little carnival or whatever, it now has armed policemen and guards running after you very violently and shooting you. So it is a very swift change, which I think they did a very good job at.
Yeah, and it should be noted that, when I say that there is racist imagery in the game, it is intentionally so to highlight how this society is. It might look really nice on the outside, but on the inside it's rotten to the core, which a lot of the imagery kind of serves to reinforce. And it's a shocking moment that's kind of meant to shake the player out of the idyllic stupor that it's been kind of luring players into up to that point.
Yes.
It's probably one of the best intros to a game out there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I was gushing over the imagery before, but yeah, the way that they set of the player is such a tone setter for the rest of the game, because you're on the run for the rest of the game after this point. And yeah, it just does such a good job of jarring the player and yeah, just really shocking them, I guess.
Yeah, and so how do we want to go through this? Because there are a whole lot of plot points.
Yes. And we don't want to just describe the whole game. I mean, unless
right.
we do want story time with Jack and Naomi.
Can I try and like sum up the order of events?
Yeah.
Major events, because there's a whole lot of stuff that happens in this.
There is, because this game is like what? It depends on how you play, but at least 60 hours, right?
60 hours? No.
No, more than that? I'm remembering wrong?
I think it's significantly shorter than that.
Oh, is it?
It's probably about 12 hours. 10 to 12 hours, yeah. So the basic setup was what I described at the beginning. But it's not as straightforward as just waltzing up to the tower, like, because it never is it? So what ends up happening, there are a bunch of setbacks, and Booker has to start running and gunning. Probably one of the best parts of this early section is Booker making his way through the, I think it's like the Order of the Raven, the Society of the Raven, something like that, which is after that startling kind of jarring opening. No surprise, it is an incarnation of the KKK that literally worshipped John Wilkes Booth and believed Abraham Lincoln was Satan. So in that section, you get to fight a bunch of these Klansmen, and it's pretty satisfying, not gonna lie. You are eventually able to make your way to Elizabeth, who is up in this giant angelic tower, and to get there you have to learn how to kind of ride the rails, because that the way things are shipped around this flying city is by this elaborate rail system that connects all of them in the sky, and Booker can use a device to kind of grapple to these rails and ride them around. The next kind of turn in the game is reaching Elizabeth, and at that point you find out that Elizabeth isn't just a normal girl. Instead, she has the ability to open these dimensional rifts. And so we are kind of, although it's been alluded to up to this point several times, we are introduced to the idea that there are multiple worlds out there. There are multiple realities, multiple dimensions. And Elizabeth has the ability to access and open up doorways to these other dimensions and pull stuff through or put stuff in. And so that then becomes a major plot point that is slowly expanded on over the course of the game. And to the point where you're eventually like traveling through time, and there are various prophecies that you learn that Father Comstock has been using her powers to kind of open these rifts into the future to see what's going to happen, which is how he knows that Booker DeWitt is coming, and how at one point Booker actually travels into the future and finds a future version of Elizabeth, who then sends him back in time with information that can help him progress in his quest to save Elizabeth. And basically it's this whole convoluted thing. In the middle of all of that, there's also this revolution going on between the forces of Father Comstock and the forces of the Vox Populi, which is a group of oppressed people who were basically brought to Colombia as slave labor. It includes all kinds of different racial and socioeconomic groups. And I'm flubbing my words. But basically, these people rise up and there's a violent revolution against Father Comstock. And then it all kind of comes to a head towards the end of the game, where I'm getting a bit hazy on the order of events. Again, we just covered a lot of stuff. But basically what ends up happening is that this device called the siphon is destroyed, which unlocks Elizabeth's true potential as the individual she is. She basically becomes this almost godlike figure that has almost omnipotent power and omniscient knowledge. And she winds up bringing Booker to a metaphorical representation of this big decision point in his life. And it's the decision point where he decided whether or not he was going to get baptized. And we'll get to why this is important later, but that decision point is what separates the person Booker DeWitt is from the person Father Comstock is, because it's revealed that they are actually both the same person, just from different realities, and this one decision kind of set off a chain reaction of events that turned them into who they were. And so Elizabeth has decided that she is going to wipe out all Father Comstocks, and in order to do that, she needs to kill Booker DeWitt. So we find out the big reveal at the end of the game is that A, there are infinite realities, hence BioShock Infinite, and B, our hero is also the villain. And of course, things get even more cuckoo bananas in the DLC, but we're gonna try and not touch on that too much, just because
we could talk forever about that alone.
There's already so much to cover.
Yeah, exactly. And so another big point is that the reason why Elizabeth has these special powers is because Booker DeWitt, in his reality, gave Elizabeth away to Father Comstock, who is him, but Elizabeth ended up leaving a tiny piece of herself in another reality, and that is with the tip of her pinky. Yeah,
so essentially what ended up happening was that Booker DeWitt had, for various reasons, had a mountain of gambling debts, and Father Comstock, who has been rendered infertile and also filled with tumors by the technology he uses to make the city fly and also open rifts to other worlds, decided that he needed an heir, and so he sent the Lutesses, who are the two people who are rowing you to the lighthouse at the very beginning of the game.
The two weirdos, which I do say very, very lovingly. I love the Lutesses.
Oh, they're amazing. He sent them to Booker DeWitt's reality to procure a child that was genetically his, but obviously not from their own reality, and Booker agreed, and then at the last minute decided he probably shouldn't sell his child, and tried to get her back, and was only able to keep a pinky of hers because the portal closed and snapped it off.
Yes. And breathe.
Yes.
So
and that's just the basic overview of the plot. We haven't even at this point mentioned all of the other layers to this game.
And there's definitely a lot that is blatantly said in various plot telling devices like notes, and then what are they, voxophones or something? Like that. And those add a whole bunch more to the story. And you can definitely read forever about fan theories and due to all the physics and all that. But yeah, we'll just talk about what we see in the game. But, oh man, this game is definitely one of the games that cements why I love games so much. Of course, it's not perfect. No game is. but this game is just able to incite so many emotions, and oh man, and I yeah, I'm getting all tripped up even trying to explain why this game is so important to me, but I think its complexity is sure, it's great and it's there, but really the simplicity of the story is also really important to it, because we have all of these allegories and stories that we keep on revisiting for a reason. It's just a part of humanity at this point. And when you boil it all down, this game is just another telling of one of those, you know, classic stories like Jack was saying earlier. We've seen this before in video games, but what makes it so compelling is that it's pretty much a character study of these two, Booker and Elizabeth. Booker is obviously this grizzled, I mean, before the reveal, he's this grizzled, no-nonsense kind of guy, and Elizabeth is this wide-eyed, naive person. But slowly over the course of the game, they kind of swap positions. You know, Elizabeth starts getting more and more jaded because she sees the type of effect that people have on the world and on each other. Like, she sees Booker kill, and they have very real conversations about why and how that feels. And there's this one section of the game that is very striking, and that's when Booker and Elizabeth go through the museum of, what was it called? Was it just the Trail of Tears, or what? I think
it was Hall of Heroes.
Hall of Heroes, yeah. So, and it covers that era, and oh my gosh. I can't remember the war specifically, but it's a war between Booker and his men and Native Americans, I believe.
Well, so it's
yes.
It's not. So the Hall of Heroes makes it out to be a war.
Okay.
It is more
commonly.
It's a
battle. That's what it was.
It's more. It's not even really a battle. More commonly today, it's known as the massacre at Wounded Knee.
That's what it is. Okay, thank you. So yeah, it's to describe what it is. It's actually kind of it's kind of weird to describe it this way, but it's like if Disneyland were to take a crack at making a display of the Battle at Wounded Knee. It has
1930s Disney.
Yes. It has like cardboard cutouts and fake fire and then voiceovers that come on. And this is a very severe PTSD moment for Booker, who doesn't really remember exactly everything in his past and who he is. Actually, I'm pretty sure he's kind of a blank slate at this point. Who knows that he has to get Elizabeth to somewhere, pretty much. So he doesn't remember who he is, and he's surrounded by his past, and then it turns out that he actually was at Wounded Knee, and he did some pretty horrible things, and he meets up with someone who was there with him. In that moment, in that whole section of the game, you are put in Booker's shoes, and you are ambushed by Comstock's men. And they're coming out from behind these cutouts. And you, as the player, are forced to massacre these people down. And then this reveal comes at the end, and it's really... It's jarring to compare those two things. It makes you think about the nature of violence. And I remember when I first played this game that it was one of the most... the deaths really felt significant. Like there was a sound effect after you killed people, and I can't make the sound effect myself, but it was kind of like if you were to ring a really massive bell. You know what I'm talking about, right? The sound. And then there's moments where you can use like your grappling hook to murder people, and it is so brutal. It is so brutal. So I think the game did a really good job at kind of showcasing players' play styles if you really paid attention to it, I guess.
Yeah. And you touched a lot on a couple aspects that I think are really foundational premise, ideas for BioShock Infinite there. That section in particular has so much going on. The Hall of Heroes, where this massacre is made out to be this heroic moment in history and time, and the one of the people who participated in it the most, Father Comstock, is made out to be this godlike hero. And another thing to kind of mention is that a lot of the things referenced in BioShock Infinite, they are historical events. Like there are a couple really big ones that you should probably be aware of for BioShock Infinite, and the first is the massacre at Wounded Knee, in which basically you had families of Native Americans camped out near the Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian reservations, and this was in 1890, and the U.S. government basically sent in a bunch of men, and things went very badly, and the U.S. Army massacred almost all of them. So obviously, saying that is a super weighty thing, and if you don't really pay... So, I say if you don't really pay attention, it can seem exploitative, but the game really, really, really goes out of its way to hammer players over the head that the massacre at Wounded Knee was a huge deal and was really, really bad and was a terrible, terrible thing. And I think a lot of people either didn't spend too much time thinking about it or thought that the game was, with the Hall of Heroes, was kind of using that kind of racist imagery nonchalantly. But the entire game hinges on how awful that event was, because the foundational theme of BioShock Infinite is violence and how human beings use violence and perpetuate violence and then also respond to violence. And so Booker DeWitt, post-massacre, knew he did something unspeakably wrong and bad and evil. And so there is a moment where he sought redemption. In that moment of seeking redemption, he had a pivotal choice whether or not to accept baptism or refuse it. And that's the key distinction between Father Comstock and Booker DeWitt. However, they're both essentially still the same person with the same ideas of using violence to kind of get what they want. On the one hand, Comstock uses his violence to kind of oppress people, and essentially his flying city is like this giant floating fortress that can rain death upon the world below, which he does use it to do during the Boxer Rebellion, which is another historical event that actually did happen, but in reality without a giant floating city. And he also wants to do that again in the future by basically conquering the world with Columbia, this floating city. But he'll be dead and Elizabeth will be in charge of it. And on the flip side of that, you have Booker, who instead of accepting the baptism, refused it and basically didn't believe that there could be a redemption for himself, and so drank and gambled his memories away of this event, which is how he ended up with the huge pile of debt and why he sold Anna, which is Elizabeth, to Comstock in the first place. And so you have these two kind of cycles of violence. On the one hand, Comstock is perpetuating this large-scale system of violence and oppression, and on the other hand, you have Booker DeWitt, who works as kind of a small-time thug for the Pinkertons in, early 1900s America. And when he is faced with the challenge of getting his daughter back, of course it then descends into murdering everyone that's in front of him.
Yep.
And the take in BioShock Infinite, I think, is more nuanced than what I'm spelling out here. I'm just again, talking about the base level of all of this, because it has you can see kind of this spiraling circle of violence and oppression, because when Father Comstock oppresses all of these socially and economically disadvantaged people, like African Americans, for example, eventually they rise up against that oppression, and there is a violent revolution against Father Comstock. And there's another moment in the game, and it's fairly early on, after Booker has been kind of discovered. There's a moment where you kind of get away, and you find yourself in a printing house for kind of like this underground subversive newspaper. And these two people are in a side room arguing about, whether or not violence is necessary to get their points across. And they're kind of, one of them is basically kind of arguing that you don't need violence to overthrow this oppressive regime. And they encourage you to just kind of leave quietly and let everything, don't hurt anybody. Except you don't actually have that option, because as soon as you leave the house, you encounter a huge squad of people who immediately try and shoot you on sight. And so Booker, in his own way, is also perpetuating this violent system, just on a small scale.
Well, he does end up killing a lot of people.
Yes.
And destroying Columbia as we know it. So, depending on how you look at things, small scale. But yes, this game, I think, is just comprised of so many of those moments where you have to pay attention. And it's just kind of awe-striking, if that's not how you word that. But anyway, you guys know what I'm saying. And we haven't even talked about Elizabeth yet, which is... Oh, man. Elizabeth is such an interesting character, especially when you get into Burial at Sea, which we will not. We will save that for another time. But in this game, she is just... She goes through such a transformation as a character. And she's impacted by the world. She also was put in this almost literal bubble where she was isolated by Comstock. He put her in this tower, and she was reading books, and eventually she could find out tears, how she could, control them and everything, but she started out very naive, because she was isolated in this way. But oh yeah, I hear you wanting to say something, so I'll let you go ahead.
I mean, basically, if to build off of my thoughts on violence, Elizabeth is the way forward and the ray of hope in this system that demonstrates that people can rise above the violent system. They can fundamentally break it. That is kind of her...
That's her representation.
Her thematic power, I guess,
yes.
in the game. And it is I think it's a really powerful arc for her. I think it has some really interesting things to say about women and the roles of women. There might be an argument in there that maybe it plays into too much into the stereotype of like women being peacemakers, but I think that it also subverts that stereotype quite a bit by having her final act kind of being murder. So,
yeah. And then, I mean, she's slowly corrupted throughout the entire story.
I don't know that it's corruption, though.
Well, I think she's not necessarily being corrupted. I think it's more like she's slowly being broken, because there's a moment where she has to kill someone, and you can just see the horror on her face and how that's completely transformed her, and it's a strong moment that's commenting on the nature of violence, which we've seen a ton of, and we kind of get used to until that moment again where she kills her first person, and it's a really important character.
Yeah, and I agree with you, but I think that because of her experiences and because of how the story frames her, that is a learning experience for her rather than a desensitizing one for her.
See,
and that I think
and I don't want to talk about Burial at Sea, but Burial at Sea definitely says the contrary.
I mean, I think it is that moment where she kind of realizes why she needs to erase Comstock and Booker.
Yes.
And that realization is also what ultimately breaks the cycle of violence that the 2/1 of them have created.
Yeah, but that's what makes this whole game and her entire arc, including Burial at Sea, so damn good, is that we have a resolution at the end of Infinite where she is seemingly successful, because after she kills the supposed final Comstock, we see each iteration of these Elizabeths disappear until there's no more. But then when we see Burial at Sea, we see a more haggard and bitter Elizabeth. And then she ends up perpetuating this cycle. But I won't get into it.
Or does she?
Yes. At least in the first part of the DLC. And then it gets more complicated.
The Burial at Sea DLC, I think, is some of the most complicated DLCs in existence. So
yes,
let's just try our best to focus on the main game. I think in the main game, her arc is pretty spelled out. The DLC really recontextualizes a lot of it, but I think it still ultimately supports my point. Maybe. We can probably circle back around to it.
Okay.
Again, whenever we talk about Burial at Sea, because again, darn fine DLC making Irrational Games, and that's why I miss that studio so much.
Yes, but they are alive again, apparently.
Kind of.
Yes, kind of. And maybe working on something, maybe. Anyway, goodness. Oh, and another big character that we have not mentioned yet, who doesn't speak actually, and that's Songbird. My goodness, there are fan theories about Songbird. And
why? Just... At a certain part of me, when I see something like that in a game, I'm like, why? There's already so much here to dig into. Songbird isn't a very complicated thing. Songbird is a giant, weird-looking flying bird monster that protects Elizabeth. That's all you need to know. And it's tragically loyal to its purpose.
Because there's a ton of information about it in Burial at Sea, of course. And yes, again, we won't go into it. But Songbird is such a strong, I guess, symbol. And I haven't really... I mean, there's that symbolism behind the moment of you as Booker choosing a locket for Elizabeth, and that's whether or not you choose her to have a cage or a bird. So there's obvious ties there, because, you can see it pretty clearly there. But Songbird, I think might be a little bit more complicated than that, aside from fan theories we won't get into. It serves as a push for the characters. Like, you run away from Songbird and you end up plunging into a beach in the sky. Because of Songbird, there's a point where Elizabeth has to kind of murder Songbird, which I will argue that is also a part of her losing her innocence.
See, I think that's her literally killing the patriarchy. Because basically how I read this game is that Songbird is both her father figure and jailer. Like, that's the creature she's had the most contact with over the course of her life. And so she understands it so well that she can actually understand what its song means. Like, the different whistles it emits, she understands those as words, which we as players don't, but she does, because she spent 20 years with this creature. And it's tragic. It's certainly tragic, but this creature has a toxic love and compulsion to protect her.
Like someone else we know. So that's another layer to Songbird, without directly devolving into a theory about how Booker is Songbird in some way. But yeah, that was another strong character that I connected pretty deeply with. And at first I couldn't really understand why, aside from it being this just giant protective force, because eventually you are able to get Songbird on your side, and during this, oh my god, the most difficult battle in the entire game on this airship, you are able to get Songbird to fight for you. So that's another way of them tugging at your heartstrings, or just getting you to think a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a character that showcases kind of the double-edged sword of certain aspects. And I'd argue most of the main central characters in this game have some degree of toxic masculinity going on. And a lot, actually. Like, there's a very strong case to be made for a very feminist reading of BioShock Infinite, because there's just so much here that is a story about a women, plural, because the leader of the Vox Populi is also a woman, women kind of overthrowing their oppressors and coming into their own power, and the ways in which they go about doing that.
Yes, and the female Lutece is also a very strong woman character. She is the one who is in the main timeline, if I'm not mistaken, and her brother is the one that she's brought, or her brother who is really actually just her from a different timeline, who is weak and getting sicker by the moment the longer he's in her reality. Or I guess they've kind of come to the point where they're able to kind of transcend reality and move in and out of it as they please.
Yeah, so basically what happened there is that Rosalind Lutece, who is the one who built Columbia, she's the reason that the city can fly. And she built the initial technology that allows people to open up these rifts and go to these other worlds, these other dimensions. And she found in one of these other dimensions her counterpart, who happened to, in that world, be born a man. And so they just kind of buddied up and decided they were just going to go universe hopping together, I guess.
And speaking in riddles and whatnot.
Yeah.
Which is adorable.
I mean, they kind of like developed their own little language between the two of them, which is, it is super adorable. But what ended up happening was, because the Luteces were the only ones who really knew the history of where Elizabeth came from, Comstock decided that they were a threat, and he had his business tycoon buddy, Fink. I think his name is actually Fink.
It is.
Try and dispose of them, except that he wasn't 100% successful. He sabotaged a machine that essentially spaghettified their consciousnesses across all of the universes, which had an effect of not killing them, but basically putting them in a kind of physics-based Schrodinger's box where they aren't really alive or dead in any of the realities that they're in.
Spaghettified was the correct term, I believe.
And so they can kind of just pop into different realities wherever they please, but they have a vested interest in screwing over Comstock because he betrayed them.
Yes.
And that's kind of their deal, which is why they keep setting Booker up to fight Comstock and rescue Elizabeth.
Which would ultimately destroy Comstock's plan of taking over the planet, basically.
Yeah, and I also think it ultimately is the only way to free themselves, because Elizabeth would then be able to kind of unmake Columbia and erase... By erasing Comstock would erase Columbia from existing, which would then mean that they would no longer have this weird state of undeath going on.
Yes.
Yeah. Again, this is a very complicated game to wrap your head around.
It's very dense. And to what you opened it with is that a lot of people can view liking this game as pretentious just because it is complicated. And yeah, sure, there's gonna be people who like this or say they like this game because it might make them look smart, but really, you can like the damn game. It's totally fine. You don't even have to be super into these other plot points. You can just play through the game and enjoy it. Phew. Now that that's off my chest.
I do think that I think the game that I think the way that this game is viewed now is largely due to it being a product of 2013.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was really interesting going back and reading a lot of the takes that people were writing about it at the time. There were a surprisingly large amount of people who wrote about thinking this game was too violent, which was interesting to me because, like, even Cliff Bleszinski, the guy who made freaking Gears of War, wrote about BioShock Infinite being too violent. And game journalists were writing about how it was too violent because it was needlessly graphic, and it was such a lovely setting and story that the violence held it back from its true potential of telling this story.
When that was the whole point, was to get us to think about violence.
Yeah, and it was interesting to me because going back and reading all of these takes, found out that I was agreeing with Jim Sterling from his Destructoid days, basically going like, no, this is entirely about how violence is used. Like, sure, you could tell this story in different ways, but
they specifically wanted to point out how violence is used as a system of oppression and how it has built societies like Colombia, which is a big ol' allegory for a certain place in this planet.
The United States of America.
And it wanted those deaths to be graphic and visceral. Like I said, there's a freaking sound effect when you murder people. And that's, it's shocking because it wants you to remember that. And it eventually wants it to kind of fade into the back of your mind. They want you to think about that.
Well, and so it is designed to both be very satisfying to kill people, and it's also designed to initially be shocking, and it's also designed to eventually become numbing, and you're supposed to kind of feel less and less shocked, because that's what
happens when you're exposed to violence over time.
Yeah. And
that's why Booker, well, I mean, this is more subtext, but that's why Booker doesn't remember all of the terrible things he did.
Well,
I mean, obviously there's a physics rift between them, but I think they wrote that into the story to make a point as well.
I think you're half right, because so part of the universe hopping thing is that the mind can't really comprehend shifting into a different universe, and so it makes up memories to kind of fit you into that other reality, which is also why you get nosebleeds like crazy. Mm-hmm. But you're half right in that it becomes easier and easier to justify violence when you have become numb to it, which is exactly the mindset that Booker and Comstock have, because they have seen and employed violence so many times to achieve what they want, that killing people isn't a big deal to them, I think that is an interesting design concept for a video game, because that's also the mindset a lot of people who play video games, first-person shooters in particular, tend to bring to the table, is that you've killed a lot of people in first-person shooters before, so it has become less and less of a big deal, but it becomes a big deal when Elizabeth sees you do it for the first time and starts acting scared of you. Mm-hmm. Because it is a big deal to her.
It is.
Also, if you have a game that's a first-person shooter, and it's not doing anything to really think about the ramifications of its violence, I think that BioShock Infinite was kind of a wake-up call, at least for me, to demand more from my games. Because there are only so many problems you can solve with a gun. And that's kind of what BioShock Infinite is all about. Is that there is a very complex society out there. There's multiple people and factions going after different things that they want. And all of them are using violence to try and solve their problems. But you can only solve so many problems that way before it starts making new problems, I guess.
Yeah, and you see that with Elizabeth. She thinks that hopping through time is going to help and fix things, but they end up causing these other horrible things to happen. Like, a good example is, I can't remember their names, but basically you seek out this person and his wife in one universe, and they do something in that universe that ends up making that person die in the other universe, which I know is so specific.
Yeah, I'm trying to think about what you're talking about.
It's when you're in the portion of the game around Fink's factory.
You're sent to go. Basically, you're sent to go arm the Vox Populi by going to see this arms manufacturer.
That's right, yes.
But he's dead in the main reality, and so Elizabeth opens a tear to another reality where he's alive, but then getting the weapons to the Vox and ends up enabling their revolution, and their revolution is really violent.
Mm-hmm. There we go.
And I will point out that at the time, again, there were a lot of think pieces about the violence in this game, and one of those think pieces, I can't remember from where or by who, but it talked a lot about how BioShock Infinite was kind of fell short because the Vox Populi were painted out to be just as bad as Comstock, which I don't agree with that premise at all. I don't think that... I mean, obviously, peaceful resistance is good. That should be the gold standard. But let's not pretend that history hasn't had good and successful things come out of violent revolutions. America! France!
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah, I can still see the point there, because, yeah, I think they do generalize a little bit with the story in making it seem like they're just trying to say, look, violence bad everywhere, instead of, like what you're saying, yeah, sometimes revolution is necessary. But I do agree with that a little bit. I don't think it detracts from the main point of the game, though.
No. I totally get what they were saying, but I think that I'm trying to think of how to phrase this politely. I think that as a society in the United States, we've been raised to kind of view the only acceptable means of societal change as being the Martin Luther King path, which worked, but I don't agree that that's the only way that change successfully happens. And I think that is typically used by people who don't want to see much change happen, I guess.
Yeah, and I think, well, no, I don't think, I know that that narrative has been oversimplified anyway. Like, it wasn't just an idealistic form of revolution. There was still violence in that.
Yeah. And so and we're kind of shifting into a conversation about how this game relates to America in a lot of ways. And it's interesting to me because this game is very much political. It's a very political game.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't think a lot of people read it as political in 2013.
And I have a little anecdote for that. I was actually talking about this game with someone a little bit earlier this week, and about how I would be talking about it on this podcast. And basically I was expressing the same sentiment we had in the beginning, was that this game is very complicated and there's a lot to talk about. And then they ended up talking about the, quote, political parts, or, quote, that part, and how they didn't like that part of the game. And I think, yeah, if you want to just play it as a first-person shooter, it might be difficult to accept and actually do an internal analysis of what this game is trying to tell you when it's being political. So that's definitely a thing that people try to avoid even in games now, with the whole, oh, don't bring your politics into my games, blah 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 blah.
Well, I think a lot of it for BioShock Infinite is that when it came out in 2013, there was a lot of content in the game that seemed so hyperbolic and so exaggerated that how could it possibly mean anything direct when it comes to politics. But I think that having it now framed in a 2018 context really hammers home that this was always about, in a lot of myriad of different ways, about America in a wide variety of different ways, and it's. I mean, people talked about it at the time. It's about American exceptionalism and how toxic that idea can be, and all of these different ideas that are specific to the United States. And in 2018, it's just that much more. That much more of this game feels real, I guess, which is kind of scary.
Just a little.
For example, I mentioned a part early on in the episode about how there is a secret society in the game that's not really secret. It's literally like right off of Main Street, but it's like the Order of the Raven. And again, they worship John Wilkes Booth, who assassinated Lincoln, and they believe Lincoln was the devil. And they say a lot of different things you can hear over different speaker systems and voxophones, that could very easily be talking points in a 2018 white supremacist rally, which, as we all know, have become more and more prevalent in modern America, which is really a scary thought. You have people who are openly running as Nazis in the United States, and with that additional context, the idea of there being like an order of people who worship John Wilkes Booth becomes a lot less ridiculous.
Yeah, definitely. And that, of course, begs the question, if we were to, as a gaming society, have this game launch now, how would it be received? You know, it's just one of those questions, the if questions.
What do you think?
I mean, it's like you said, it would be a lot less hyperbolic than it was in 2013, because in 2013 when it released, we also had the Arab Spring, which I think had a big influence on how the revolution and all that was perceived. The revolution in the game was perceived. So I think, it depends on the audience that we're analyzing, I guess. It's a tough question.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that there is certainly like this element of it being. I think people are better equipped in 2018 to parse dense games like BioShock Infinite. I don't think we would see as many think pieces about violence being out of place in this game, because I think more people would get it.
Yeah, and we've had such a, I don't know how to phrase this, but such a turnover in the amount of school shootings and mass shootings that as a society we have come to grips with the fact that we have become a more violent society as a whole, at least in this part of the world. So we're not going to tackle a game like that and say, hey, you know, that's way too much. We're either going to be numb with it and accept it as another video game that has a lot of violence in it, or we're going to have the take that we kind of did earlier, where we say, this game wants you to think about it more, and maybe it would have been appreciated in that aspect because it does make the player think about what they're doing if they're paying attention.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think in 2018 there are more players who are attuned to the language of video games to be able to pick up on those themes and those messages and those meanings, because it was disappointing to me actually to go back and look at these older reviews from people who work in the gaming industry, and they continue to do work in the gaming industry, and they've done some really good work in the game industry, but to see a lot of these people at least to me, seemingly miss the point of the game entirely.
Yeah, I mean, it's just living in that more idyllic bubble, you know, before we had so many horrible events in a concentrated amount of time, you know, between 2016 and now. We've had an obscene amount of mass shootings and school shootings and all of that, which is just force people to think about that and think about it pretty much every day, you know. So I can understand where those takes came from, or at least I can understand why they happened. But yeah, I mean, it's such a huge part of the game that, yeah, I definitely understand the disappointment as well. That was like the first thing that struck me, is because literally the turning point in the game is this huge offset of violence. Like, you are being hunted down as this, whatever they call it, the Antichrist.
Basically.
And you're being shot at. And it's just such a huge shift that it is like so literally in your face. I can't understand how that would have been missed. I mean, it's so much there. That's why Colombia is so beautiful, is because they want to showcase the ugly side of things that much more.
Yeah. Well, and I think that in a way, the BioShock Infinite can be read as somewhat of an indictment of the wider game industry as a whole for so casually using violence as a primary method of storytelling.
Yes.
Because you can pick out, I would say, maybe 90% of games and say, that in 90% of games, you use violence to solve problems.
I would say even almost more than that. It is in the majority, for sure, of games. Like, I've talked to developers who have specifically sought out to make non-violent games, and they've told me how difficult that is. Because if you look at a seemingly innocent game like Mario, there are so many violent elements in there. You are stomping things to death, you are destroying, you are plundering, but it's a cute little beep game, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's in everything, maybe except like Tetris. But even in Tetris there's destruction. I don't know, like,
well, destruction isn't inherently a bad thing, but
yeah,
destruction is different than violence.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, like, there are so many things to touch on with this game, and we just don't have the time. There's the whole colonial aspect of BioShock Infinite, in which Colombia is essentially going around the world and kind of throwing its military might around from the safety of the sky, which is often a lot of what the United States does in its modern military endeavors. Like,
and building its wealth off the back of the disenfranchised and keeping them in a system of disenfranchisement, whatever that word is, and building these seemingly beautiful places for the wealthy to live in.
Yeah, and so then you're touching on the aspect of capitalism, which this game takes on. I wouldn't say directly, but it's there. There's a whole element of how this city in the sky has kind of hoarded a lot of the wealth, and to the point where it's almost literally just has slaves doing menial labor, and a lot of the voxophone records are interesting little looks into how people managed to retain their humanity under that kind of an oppression. So there are just all these little aspects that we have barely even brushed on, but and maybe we can make a case for why we need to come back and talk about BioShock Infinite again sometime in the future, because again, we're not talking about everything, but I think that this game is really notable for its climactic ending that essentially has God in the form of a woman drowning the two men that have created the violent system that she has lived in.
Mm-hmm.
And
we haven't even talked about the amazing symbolism of the lighthouses, because there's always a lighthouse and there's always a man.
And there's always a city.
So, is this a yes for you?
Oh, absolutely.
And I bet you can guess what I'm going to say.
You're going to say... Oh, darn it. I thought you were going to say Tails.
It is a yes for me as well. Like I said before, it is one of the games that I can use as evidence for why I love games so much. And that's a special thing to do in my book.
Yeah. Well, we didn't go 2 hours this week.
And I guess before we completely derail, or not derail, but
skyrail.
I suppose I owe you fair listeners a contrarian corner, since we haven't had one of those in a while. And the one I wanted to read is very long, so I'm going to paraphrase parts of it. And this is from Kershwunk, I think. And they wrote this review in April 10th, 2013. And they say, the story starts out promising and highbrow, but it turns into a bad Star Trek episode. Too much time traveling, alternate dimensions, and rape of the space-time continuum. it was impossible to relate to, and I just didn't care in the end. Okay, changes from the
I want to interject. I don't believe that there was any time travel in this game. Even though I mentioned time travel, you're going to different dimensions where things are coexisting just slightly in the future. It's not time travel, it's dimension hopping, different things.
Yes. Oh, and since that brought up a point I wanted to bring up, I will bring it up quickly. Towards the end game, when you are separated from Elizabeth, and she is brought into Comstock's grasp, and eventually she is tortured and made into what Comstock wants her to be. And that is just such chilling storytelling, because as Booker, you don't see any of this time passing. Or however, as Jack just said, it's not time travel, it's different. But he is still looking for Elizabeth, and as he's traveling through this institution, he's getting bits and pieces of what happened to her. And then you're hearing Elizabeth turning into Comstock, and it is just so heartbreaking and moving. And there's even a part where you're in an elevator and you can just see stuff happening in the background. It's such an insane part, and I wanted to bring that up.
Also, important point to note that builds on what you just said. When you break the siphon in later on in the game, Elizabeth obtains all of her memories from all of the other realities. So she knows exactly what was done to her in those other realities where she was tortured by Comstock. And that's part of the reason, part of what fuels her to do what she does at the end. Anyway.
Yeah. And another quote to kind of build on that, and I can't remember exactly how it goes. Elizabeth asks Booker something like, "Are you afraid of Comstock?" or something like that, and he says, "No, but I'm afraid of you."
It's the opening line of the game.
Is it the opening line?
Yeah, it's literally the very first line, and it's delivered on just a black screen.
Yeah. Okay, so it's kind of a yeah. You're right.
It's "Are you afraid of God?"
There we go.
Booker responds, "No, but I'm afraid of you."
Yeah, that was yes. Yes. So basically, this contrarian does not like the gun limit, ammunition, and the fact that the guns, quote, didn't look sexy anymore. They made the game into a generic first-person shooter. They were not a fan of the handyman, and I'll read this paragraph as well. It says, in BioShock 1 and 2, it makes sense why the people around you are all acting crazy. Constant use of plasmids, plus the radical individualist, dog-eat-dog world of Rapture. In Infinite, it's never quite clear why people are so indescribably out of their minds.
Because people have bought into this cultist mentality. It's a cult of personality.
There isn't a chemical element to it this time, just ideological reasons, which is never quite believable. Again, we do not necessarily believe with these contrarians. They are contrarians for a reason.
We live in a time where people believe that someone who posts on 4chan under the letter Q is pulling strings in an international ring that is run out of a pizza shop to sell children. What? And that's believed by like 30% of the population.
All right,
it's just crazy that people would do crazy things in a cult of personality.
I will close out this review before Jack has a breakdown.
I'm just so upset at the world we live in.
So to close it out, this person says, I believe the first BioShock was the best video game ever made. BioShock 2 is pretty decent as well. BioShock Infinite failed to deliver in just about every way. The gameplay was generic and easy. The storyline was convoluted, and no, it was not easy if you didn't play on anything besides easy. Anyway, the storyline, convoluted and unrewarding. There was no sense of horror, no sense of romance, no sense that anything made any sense. Now, of course, this is just my opinion. I'm not criticizing anyone who enjoyed the game. Nay, I envy those people. Yes. There's a reason why I picked this contrarian. And I think it's because they represent the other side of things where they focus more on, I guess, the gameplay mechanics and that kind of more generic, dramatic video game story rather than one that makes you think. And that's not to sound pretentious.
This is the kind of player that wants the story that game developers need to spell things out to. It's why we get tutorials that beat people over the head repeatedly with how to play the game. It's because there are just some people out there that need games absolutely spelled out, letter by letter, otherwise they don't pick it up. Because on the one hand, I understand what you're saying, Naomi. Like this person is someone who appreciates how the game feels to play. But I don't think that should be confused with someone who really super cares about mechanics. Because if they super cared about mechanics, they would also care about what the mechanics are saying as a storytelling device, which is the thing that separates video games from movies. And so sometimes games are purposely not as fun to play as they could be. And maybe that says something. Maybe that was intentional.
No, just game bad. Game bad.
I'm sorry. I feel like I have gotten on a high horse.
I found your nemesis, didn't I? My goodness.
I'm putting my high horse into rehab. And chilling out now. Okay. I apologize to our contrarian, who I'm sure has a very refined view of games 5 years later. And I'm okay now. Thank you. How are you?
Okay. Doing great. Doing good. How are you?
Haha.
All right. So we both think that this is one of the best games, period. We, of course, dear listeners, will ask your opinion on the Twitter, if Naomi happens to remember that week.
Did we remember? Did we remember to do that?
No.
Okay. It's the best game, period. Nothing you can do about it.
Exactly. Unless, our words are final, and I don't give you a voice. So. But yeah, you can follow us on the Twitterverse, and we also have an Instagram and a Facebook. And where can our listeners listen to this amazing podcast?
Well, you can find us over on SoundCloud, iTunes, Libsyn. We also are now on Stitcher. And you can find us under Best Games, period, or The Best Games, period. You can also find us over on Patreon, and we really appreciate anyone who goes there to support us and for as little as $1, you can get access to a number of Patreon-only episodes. And, we're hopefully going to do some cool things with that soon. We're probably going to revamp, like, the pay structure. But, the pay structure. Wow, gosh, that sounded super corporate. We're going to probably just... We're going to put
restructure the ergonomics and... capitalize on the gamification, and
we're gonna put more cool stuff on Patreon. That's all I'm saying. Mergers, acquisitions, stock buybacks,
LLC,
capitalism, and you can find us on all of those places. You can also find us on community.extra-life.org. And if you've never heard of Extra Life before, it's this wonderful charity that's part of Children's Miracle Network Hospitals. And basically, people play games, and they raise money for sick and injured kids in hospitals. And when you sign up, you can actually choose which hospital you want to raise money for, and you just everything you raise goes directly to that hospital to help sick and injured kids. So if you like playing any kind of game, it can be a tabletop, an outdoor game, it can be an inside video game, or an outside video game if you have a mobile thing you want to play on. But
Switch.
Just get some
3DS.
get some friends together and play some games and raise some money. Maybe be like, hey, come play games with me on this day.
Twister.
And each of you pay $5, and that $5 will go to a sick and injured child that needs some help.
Yes.
And you can learn more over at extra-life.org. Please head over there to learn more and maybe sign up. Maybe make a team with some of your friends. Have a bake sale.
Sign up with a local guild.
Yeah. Stream with friends or enemies for good. And with that, next week we will be here either with Deus Ex, Human Revolution, or we might have a guest to do Mass Effect Andromeda to continue our sci-fi month.
Indeed.
Anything to add, Naomi?
Nope. Nothing here.
Oakley dokley. And we will see you next time on the Flippity Dippity.